All right. You guys ready?
No, I don't have it. I did a draft.
So no, you're not ready? Are you ready? I'm ready. Hi. Here, it is. Um, so I'm going to lecture here on the chapter 10 readings. There's modules there. Tomorrow, in our long block, we're going to be applying ideas and those that you heard the other day from Mr. Zeller to a case study. We're going to look at Nairobi, Kenya, as an example of rapid population, the related land use changes that come from that, and we'll do some thinking about the outcomes and such. But for today, I'm going to talk to you about land management and try to make a lot of connections back to this idea of the tragedy of the commons and this idea of like the role of ethics and such in decision making. So we'll start here. Question I have for you. Well, I'll tell you more about the place in a few minutes. I made giving away too much last time. I'm not going to do that again. What has value there? And you're allowed to say nothing if that's what you think. You just need to explain why. Like to you personally. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. In general, what has value?
Well, for me personally, there's water and the air looks good and clean.
Okay.
So both of those things have inherent value, but depending on what, like if there's an animal that uses rocks for shelter,
Okay.
or something, like everything.
Okay. So it has more value if it is useful habitat for some other species. Interesting. Nice. I like that one. That is water right there. This is the desert that you're looking at. So yeah, that water has value. Yes, it does. And I'll tell you, since you brought it up, it's a good time to mention it. This place is home to kind of a unique creature, the bighorn sheep. Look a lot like your ram, my CDS ram. Live in this place. They live in the mountains around here. And that water would be, I mean, there are other places to get water if you know where to go, but that water would have a lot of value to them. What else? What has value? Would you want this place if it was made available to you? How much would you pay for it? That's a stupid question. Don't answer that. But what has value? Nothing? I'm going to take your silence to mean nothing. If you mean nothing, you need to explain it. What else?
Oh, it's pretty, and like in the book,
Okay.
about how some national parks are just one.
Just because they're pretty, right? What else?
Well, everything there has like natural value.
Okay. So there's this term natural capital we heard the other day. You could argue that all of it has some kind of value on that level. To get back to the just because it's pretty, yeah, and it's easy to kind of like snicker at it because it's hard to make money off of pretty, but it's not that hard. But the point is that that's enough, and it's about and I'm going to show you a picture of a guy named John Muir in a little while who wrote a lot of the intrinsic value of places. This place has value because it is the way it is. It's unique. It's visually stimulating, whatever the case. Okay. So this place, just so you know, so I can tell you about it because I love talking about it. This is the Sheephole Valley Wilderness area. That down there is the Sheephole Valley. These are the Sheephole Mountains. And it is in Southern California, not too far from Palm Springs and Joshua Tree National Park. In fact, so Joshua Tree is out of the frame that way a little bit, kind of behind us. Looking north is the Mojave National Preserve. huge tract of land managed by the Park Service. Death Valley National Park is, I don't know, 100 and something miles north of there. There's a lot going on in the region. And this place is designated as wilderness. Wilderness in the legal sense. It's been legally defined as wilderness. And what that means is it's the most restricted land use. It's very highly regulated. There's a lot of stuff that's not allowed. The list of things that is allowed is much shorter. And basically the list is you can walk or you can ride a horse. That's about it. Nothing mechanical, so no vehicles of any kind. No permanent structures, no roads, and it's supposed to be free from human interference, if you want to think of it that way. It's also big. It's a big wilderness area. This is managed by the federal government. The Bureau of Land Management manages a lot of the desert, and it's not often you see one of these areas that actually covers the mountains and the valley in between. So that's kind of unique. One of my favorite places in the world. A lot of great memories there, and it is special for a lot of reasons. But anyway, okay. So what's it worth to you, right? That was the question. Here, I want to show you this. It's time that I'm a little worried about, but I think I can do it if I'm smart about it. I want to show you, it's about 5 minutes of video here. The video is from a documentary called The Corporation, which is, and I'm giving away a little of my bias here. I'm not showing you the larger documentary for a lot of reasons, but the documentary itself is very left-leaning and very preachy, I guess I'd say, about certain economic things and corporations specifically. The reason I'm showing you this, I just want you to know that. I'm not showing you it for those reasons. I'm showing you that because I just want you to be aware of the tone. You're going to hear a lot from perspective and some from another. But you hear both of these perspectives, and you hear them pretty clearly articulated. And that's why I'm showing this to you. One perspective is one that would argue in favor of privatizing natural resources. Privatization is the way to ensure sustainability, is the crux of the argument being made there. And there's something to that. That's one way of thinking about it. The other argument is the opposite of that. This idea that maintaining common, the common, keeping resources more in the public realm would be better. And we have these competing points of view. And each of these points of view reflect two ends of the spectrum. As is usually the case, especially in political conversations like this one, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And the truth might be different for one issue or resource or another, right? So just keep that in your mind, please. As we're watching, these questions are not something we're gonna like sit down and write answers to, but just keep them in your mind as you watch and as we go through the rest of this. Okay? How can we manage resources sustainably without limiting economic growth or without reducing quality of life somehow? The other thing is, what role do the public sphere, the private sphere, and regulations have in ensuring the sustainable development of resources? Because there's a lot of overlap there, and but there can also be a lot of competing interests. So I'm going to let this play here. Like I said, it's about 5 minutes. Where'd my thing go? There it is. I can't get rid of that little message up there, so I'm just going to leave it. The resolution got weird, but we'll be okay.
amount of water outside the coastal limits for exploitation. In this century, we went after the air, and we divided into air corridors that could be bought and sold for commercial traffic for airplanes. And then, of course, the rest is history.
So that was just a little overview. Now you're going to hear one side of the argument, which is the anti-private.
What we're seeing is yet another enclosure, and if you like, private taking of the commons. One of the things I find very interesting in our current debates is this concept of who creates wealth. That wealth is only created when it's owned privately. What would you call clean water, fresh air, a safe environment? Are they not a form of wealth? And why does it only become wealth when some entity puts a fence around it and declares it private property? Well, that's not wealth creation, that's wealth usurpation.
Over the centuries, we have put more and more things in that public realm, and lately, just lately, in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 decades, money. So, firefighters, for instance. Firefighters started as private contractors. And if you didn't have the medallion of a given firefighter brigade on your house and it was on fire, those firefighters would just, ride on by because you didn't have a deal. Well, we gradually evolved a public trust for the provision of safety on that very level. This is important. We should not go back from that and start saying, well, why don't we put that back in the market and see what that does? Maybe it'll make it more efficient.
Privatization does not mean you take a public institution and give it to some honest person. It means you take a public institution and give it to an unaccountable tenant.
Again, his point of view.
Public institutions have many side networks. For one thing, they may purposely run the laws. They're not private. They may purposely run the laws because of the side networks. So, for example, if a public steel industry runs the laws, it's providing cheap steel to other industries. Maybe that's a good thing. Public institutions can have a countercyclical property. So that means that they can maintain employment in periods of recession, which increases demand, which helps you get out of recession. Private company can't do that. Recession, throw out the workforce to make money.
There are those who intend that one day everything will be owned by somebody. And we're not just talking goods here, we're talking human rights, human services, essential services for life, education, public health, social assistance, pensions, housing. We're also talking about the survival of the planet, the areas that we believe must be maintained in the control, or we collectively die. Water and air.
Even in the case of air, there's been some progress.
So here's the other perspective.
The idea is to say, look, you can't avoid the dumping of carbon dioxide. You can't avoid the dumping of sulfur oxide. You can't avoid stuff like that. So we're dumping a certain amount of stuff into the environment. So we're going to say, current tonnage of sulfur oxide, for example, we will say that is the limit, and the trade permits for that amount, give them to the people who've been doing the polluting, and now we will permit them to be traded. So now, there's a price attached to polluting the environment. Now, wouldn't it be marvelous if we had one of those prices for everything?
You're advocating private ownership of every square inch of the planet.
Absolutely.
Every
on. Okay, there we go. So, two ways to think of it. And the ultimate question is, how do we grow and develop sustainably? Well, on one end, people are suggesting keep resources, keep this public trust, manage them this way. This is how we can ensure that they're not being manipulated or overconsumed by those managing them. On the other end, the argument's being made that if you monetize it, if you can, for example, as he was describing cap and trade with the emissions, carbon emissions, this idea that now there's a price to polluting. There's something to that, right? Like, but the bigger idea is that by attaching prices or by monetizing natural capital and ecosystem services, these natural processes, you create a situation where the person, the individual responsible for managing that thing, whatever it is, their short-term welfare, their money is going to come from its preservation. Okay, if we want the river to be clean, somebody should be able to make money off of the river being clean. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's basically the idea. And what was described at the beginning of the clip was the fact that over time, these common resources tend to be privatized. And in some cases, maybe that's for the best. Maybe some cases it's unavoidable. There's a lingering question of to what extent would that be to our benefit or not in the context of the environment and consumption of resources and so on. End of the day, it comes down to decision making and therefore the ethics, the values of those involved. Okay, this was something that came up yesterday. We were hearing about the tragedy of the commons. The phrase was that there is no technical solution to some of these issues we're talking about. No technical solution, right? Behaviors need to change. Like some kind of foundational behavior or ethical reasoning or whatever the case needs to shift or change if some of these issues are going to be addressed. There's a range of perspectives that's going to exist. You just saw the two examples, two of the. Hopefully we're seeing how it's all related, right? If we're gonna be able to grow economically, by maintaining high qualities of life, because people are going to want that, without degrading the environment, then there will be some ethical underpinning making to that. And this here guy, Aldo Leopold, to my knowledge, he was the first to coin this term, a land ethic. And we could extend that to just like a resource ethic or a consumption ethic, if you want to think about that. He was a trained ecologist. He was very early in the days of the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service. He was was a manager and establish and practice and kind of develop the field of conservation biology. This was a new thing. The University of Wisconsin has a school of conservation biology named after him. Sand County Almanac was a place in Wisconsin. So the point is, he's a very this is a seminal text. He was a very kind of a thought leader in this this kind of field, this idea of like land ethics. And he wrote in 1949, right around the same time Rachel Carson was writing. And Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, if you recall, your summer reading. And this was happening at a time when the United States had just experienced, or is still experiencing, from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, huge amounts of population growth, economic growth, like crazy. People are getting rich, and like lifestyles are changing. But what's also happening is that the negative effects of all of that growth is becoming readily apparent in the form of pollution, in the form of in Leopold's case, he talks a lot about land and ecosystems degrading and becoming less productive over time. this was all becoming more and more obvious, and Leopold argued, and Carson did too, to an extent anyway, that if our emphasis is going to be economic growth and development, if that's going to happen, what first needs to happen is the natural capital that underlies all of that, the natural systems that are in place, should be treated as the foundation for the economy, and not some tool to be used. Right? He was arguing that if you want these things, then you need to value the natural capital differently and treat it better, basically. And Carson was suggesting the same thing, right? If we don't want to live in a world where we are, free from pests and kind of minimizing our impact and exposure to these things, well then, chemicals everywhere isn't the way to go. It's to more logically about it. Think about the system and try to live within the system, right? Be a part of the land, not separate from it. And this I'm using this as an example because it reflects a land ethic that became more and more central to the conservation movement in the United States. Where did it come from? Quick little history here. Excuse me. Prior to 1850, kind of into the 1800s and 1830s, I believe, if I'm could be off my decades a little bit, but westward expansion is happening. And the whole time that westward expansion, manifest destiny is playing out, there is this what's come to be known as frontier ethic, or this frontier attitude, which was that humans exist in opposition to nature, and the frontier was something to be conquered. It was to be feared, and for a good reason. It was pretty easy to catch a disease during the winter in the frontier and not survive. That was a lot. So there's a good reason to be afraid, of the frontier, of the wild. But as we tamed the wild, we meaning Americans in the United States, as that started to happen, and as we started to lose wild places, it got bigger and more polluted, and quality of life kind of dipped a little in the urban areas, for example. It became more and more clear that people valued wild spaces. They valued natural capital in different ways than previously. And upon reaching the West Coast, the government is in a position where they have a huge amount of land to manage and the resources in that land to manage. And so now we have a situation where people are feeling sentimental. They're feeling loss over some of the wild spaces that used to kind of define our country. They're also experiencing some negative impacts of pollution and other such things. And we have a government now that's tasked with, in a very democratic way, managing these resources. So we have a situation here where these are all being woven into the political discourse of the country. And this kind of movement around these competing interests are kind of trying to gain footholds in different places. Conservation movements growing and so on. And it continues to this day. It hasn't really changed a lot. And in a lot of ways, we kind of go in this cycle where we make choices, we learn from those choices, we make other choices, and sometimes and policies change and politics change, but the conversation's been going on for a long time. Excuse me. On here, after 1850, a lot of describes been land is starting to be set aside for preservation purposes, to be kept as is. They're so special that I don't want to mess with them. Yellowstone was the first national park. Yosemite and California were state parks, and then became national parks. 1890, remember that year. The Decision Act, this is a law that was passed that kind of restructured a lot of the government. The government now has these tasks of managing resources they didn't have before. So we have new agencies and such. A lot of the agencies you still see to this day, they just have different names. So 1890, Yosemite National Park. This is in Yosemite National Park. This is a valley called Hetch Hetchy. you're going to need to be familiar with. You're going to want to be familiar with what I'm calling their managing philosophy. You can think about it, what they manage. It's just the kind of thing, talking about land use in the United States, we're going to be talking about these agencies, so you want to be aware of them. Another piece of California. This one's right on the Colorado River, not pictured, but it's over there. The Dead Mountains in the background. Another wilderness area, by the way. So that's what it looks like. Map of the area. Mountains here, shown there in the background, going across. But it's as if we're standing. We'd be like standing here, looking at the mountains. And if you look at the map, there's a lot going on. This is Bureau of Land Management land, BLM land. And that is shown here by the gold color. The wilderness boundary is this thick gray line here. Notice this weird thing here. It's called the cherry stem. That's the wilderness boundary. So on this side is designated wilderness. That side of the line is not. You'll note also at the wilderness area, we've got these white squares. Those are privately owned, going way back to when the westward expansion was occurring. And railroads were being built. We didn't know exactly where they were going to go, but we wanted them to go. So what the government did was they just gave kind of checkerboard of land to the different rail companies, and they could sort of pick their path. And then they also got to keep the land afterwards, even if they didn't use it. So a lot of that land's been sold off through the years. Some of it's still owned by corporations and such. But and the BLM is actually in the business of buying land. Doesn't cost a whole lot. But because, for example, they're trying to manage this as a wilderness area, and that private land is, if I want to build a house on my private land, I can build a house on my private land. It does not matter if it's inside this wilderness boundary because I'm on my land. For example, the blue squares belong to the state. So here we have private, state, and federal land all next to each other inside a federally designated wilderness area. Right across the street from a Native American Indian reservation, the Fort Meadow Indian Reservation. So it's one thing to say this is a wilderness area, but the management of that wilderness area is not as simple as saying it's a wilderness area. Still, even with that designation, these competing interests present. Right? It's multiple use. It's multiple use agency. It's a difficult balance to strike. When I worked for these people years ago, the manager I worked for used to talk about how if nobody's happy, I'm probably doing my job. Because if anybody's too happy, then I've definitely screwed over somebody else. So his goal was always to make sure everybody's kind of equally displeased, and then he doing the best he could. It's an exaggeration. It's maybe a dramatization of it, but it felt that way sometimes, for sure. This is the road. Roads are not supposed to be in wilderness. So what do? We draw the wilderness boundary around the road. The road's not in wilderness. Another interesting management challenge. The reason they did that, just for what it's worth, these were relatively recently designated, 1994, which in the grand scheme of things was pretty recent. Haven't had a lot of wilderness designated since then. And there's a lot of it. And so they really, like the conservationists, the preservationists really kind of shot for the moon. They went for everything. And it turns out they got it. So they drew these kind of wacky maps thinking like, well, we'll go for it, see what happens. And they ended up getting it. So now these weird wilderness boundaries that go around roads and stuff. A lot of these, there's probably an old mine site up there. A lot of these roads were built 200 years ago and aren't used, but they exist. Anyway, multiple use creates issues. Okay, depending on what values are, what the political situation is, and what the funding's, these other things, you can come out with some very. Not far from there, and just outside Joshua Tree, showing you these just to illustrate the point a little further. These are wind turbines just outside Joshua Tree National Park. These are solar panels recently installed just outside Joshua Tree National Park. Remember that the dam I showed you, Hetch Hetchy, was in Yosemite. It still is. The decision was made to change the original decision. Why? Because situations changed. So as we look at regulations, as we look at these agencies and philosophies and all these things, I want you to remember that these things change over time. Sometimes it's gradual, slow change. Sometimes it's not. Elections happen, for example. But we shouldn't be thinking about regulations as being permanent. That's the imagination. The ethical and these valuations we placed are not permanent. They change as supply and demand changes. So maybe the land just by Joshua Tree is just too valuable not to put solar panels on. We might not want to stand in a national park and see solar panels, but it's the decision that's been made. Right? We might not want to stand in Yosemite and see a dammed river, but it was anyway. So anyway, that's I'll get off my soapbox, but that's the idea. Some maps, just to kind of illustrate a few things. The United States here, that's all of the publicly owned land. That's all the federal land, excuse me, in the United States. You can see most of it's in the West. A symptom of, or an outcome of what I was talking about before, right? We expanded westward, and now the government owns all this land, and what are they going to do with it? Well, they still own a lot of it. About 42% of the U.S. is publicly owned. I don't know. It seems like a lot to me. On the right, you see these global world map with these protected areas. Protected can mean a lot of different things, and there are actually all these different definitions of levels of protection in your text, which you could be familiar with. But my take home for you right now on that topic is basically this. Protected can mean a lot of different things. And just because it's been designated as protected, it doesn't mean anything's being enforced. Maybe it is. I don't want to be overly cynical. But just be aware of that, right? How these things are defined is going to be based on the place and the time that those definitions were made. And how things have changed since then. But you can see where most of the protected land is. Internationally, a lot of them are kind of unique and interesting places. The African savanna. A lot of them are places where a lot of people don't live also. So makes it a little bit easier. And just because I can't stop talking about wilderness, this is that same map. It's just all in shades of green. The dark green are the most restricted area, the designated wilderness areas. Most of those were established in the 60s through the 80s, but you see a few more recent ones. 2014 there in Michigan. Places that have been determined to be pristine enough that we are going to try to keep them that way. Whether they're in a park, a forest, or some other place. Wilderness can occur on any kind of federal land. It can be managed by the Bureau of Land Management. It can be managed by the Park Service. It just depends where it is. This graphic is looking not just at federal land, but all of the land, public and private. Okay, so everything I just showed you, all this protected land, all that federal land, some of that is used for grazing. Some of that is used for timber production. Some of that is used for recreation and wildlife. All true. But if you think about just as far as uses go, timber, crops, grazing, right? It's food and natural resources. And the amount of land we have isn't going to change. If we're going to have more people, well, there's not that much more cropland out there. Not in this country anyway. That might be like in Africa, for example, in other parts of the world. That might not be as true. But, for example, we're going to have roughly the same amount of cropland as we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But we're going to need to get more food out of it. If we're going to have the same number of forests, and we've already cut down a lot of them, how are we going to maintain timber production into the future with this growing population? Big unknowns there, and a lot of it's going to come down to management. And it's going to come down to, whoops, not this one. It's going to come down to decision making and all of these factors I just talked about. And maximum sustainable yield is the goal. Right? If land is going to be our resource, if we're going to get resources from the land, how we can maximize that in a sustainable way. The term sustainable implies into the future, into perpetuity, right? There's no limit on how long this can last. It's sustainable. So with grazing, it's about there are laws in place to protect water and such and limit overgrazing, but enforcement can be an issue on private land, for example. Are people going to prioritize short-term welfare over long-term welfare? In terms of forests, it's about how you cut the forests, what's cheapest, what's easiest. It tends to be clear-cut, but if people are more willing to invest time and effort in other ways of doing things, then things will change. But if not, then they won't. So, this is the kind of thing, I know we're running out of time, but we will revisit some of these things, this idea of overgrazing and forest management, when we talk about pollution and pollution. So we'll get a lot more specific about agricultural methods and stuff down the road. For today, it's just about decision-making, ethics, and land use kind of options. Okay. Last little bit is on urban growth, suburban and urban growth. The idea being that as populations grow, cities tend to grow, but rural populations don't. And that has some interesting outcomes on natural systems, as well as on North St. Louis, for example. So we'll tackle some of this tomorrow. Tomorrow, this is a big part of what you're going to be looking at. If you haven't done your reading yet, please do. You're going to be asked to know a few things from the lectures and such, and apply a few of these ideas to, I think I already told you, Nairobi, Kenya. So, questions for me before you go? Thoughts or concerns? Okay, I think I'm done. Have a good one.